Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. My name is James King. This is the Culverhouse College of Business is happy to host this MLK Day event to discuss Dr. King's civil rights pursuits and how they encompass social justice, extending into the employment context. We'll also discuss some contemporary employment issues that bear considering and perhaps pursuing from a justice perspective. Our panel today includes Dr. Maura Mills, an associate professor of management. We also have Sam Addy, who's an associate dean for economic development outreach and senior research economist. I want to thank them for agreeing to participate today. They'll say more about themselves and their topics when they speak, but Maura will focus on gender and work family issues from a social justice perspective, and Sam will focus on income and other tax structure issues from an economic justice perspective. Again, my name is James King. I'm the Miles Rose Professor of Leadership. And as of April, I became the Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion in Culverhouse. I will serve as host and will share some background on MLK and how he and his trip to Memphis speak to projecting social justice into an employment-related issues. First, some organizational notes. Let me thank Dean Kay Palin for her support for this and all of our DEI efforts, and to thank faculty, staff, students, alumni, and community partners who are engaged with us in DEI in various ways. I greatly appreciate you. For those of you who have joined us today, we want you to share your questions and input in the chat area, where Zach Thomas, our Director of Communications, and Kelsey Long, my graduate assistant, will help organize your input and share it with the panel and the audience. So feel free to ask questions in the chat, but also we'd like to for you to list contemporary employment-related issues that you think are or should be viewed through a social justice lens. We intend to finish the formal presentation around 12:30, and we'll stay around to discuss your questions and comments until around 1 p.m. For students who want the lead credit associated with this panel, Kelsey will post a QR code in the chat screen as we finish up the presentations around 12:30. And I also want to let you know we're recording this session, and it will be posted on our DEI page at Culverhouse. I think that covers the organizational aspects. So for my part of the presentation, my approach will be to provide some context to the panel by thinking about my journey to understanding and coming up with the question that's the title of our panel, which is why was MLK in Memphis? I want to dedicate my part of the presentation to my father, James E. King Sr., who passed away a few weeks ago from COVID-19 complications. I constructed and wrote most of what I'll say while sitting in the hospital parking lot or in a hotel room, staying close to him in his final days. God's given me peace in knowing my father is at peace, but forgive me if I get emotional in some parts as we cover this. So the story of the panel and my understanding of why MLK was in Memphis starts with my introduction to Martin Luther King as a person. I don't remember the first time I heard MLK's voice, but I'm confident of where I was at the time. That's because I'm positive I heard his voice before I started to capture memories, before I was 1 year old. So let me stop and say I'm not related to Dr. King. However, given that I'm a Black man whose title and name is Dr. James E. King Jr., I've been asked that question quite a few times. In fact, as a child growing up in the 70s, kids and adults would tease me by calling me Dr. King, mostly for their amusement, because after the 50th time, I didn't find it amusing anymore. But I understood not to fight about it because there are worse things you can be called on the playground than Dr. King. In terms of the name, Dr. King and I actually have more in common than meets the eye. So both of us have had our names changed when we were children. So some of you probably know, but most of you probably don't, that Martin Luther King's birth name is actually Michael King. He was born Michael King, as was his father. That was changed when MLK was 5 years old. That's a story for another day, or you can just Google it if you don't believe me. The reason I'm sure I heard MLK's voice before I was one is a practical fact. It's more of a spiritual relationship than a biological one. So growing up in rural North Alabama, right outside of Huntsville, my mother would turn on the radio every Sunday morning to WEUP. That's We Up, 1600 on your AM radio dial. And one of the programs we listened to every Sunday morning was Martin Luther King Speaks. As the name of the program implies, each Sunday morning they would play a sermon or a speech or something from Martin Luther King. It was from that radio program that I have my first memory of hearing Martin Luther King's voice. That memory's from when I was around 4 or so, but from doing research, I know the program started when I was 1. So I have no doubt I heard that voice starting when I was 1. So with that memory of that voice, it's the beginning of this question. Why was MLK in Memphis? So even as a 4-year-old, hearing his voice, I understood that MLK was different, that he was special. Even at that age, I felt the power and the majesty in his voice, in his oratory. As a kid growing up in a devoutly Baptist family, by the time I was 4, I'd probably heard several hundred sermons on the radio or in person, at least. So when I heard MLK talk on the radio, he was just another radio preacher. Still, I knew he was special, not just because he had a better voice and a bigger vocabulary than most other radio preachers. He was also special because he was a radio preacher who didn't seem to have a church of his own. See, I understood even at 4 that when radio preachers came on, they were always preceded by some announcement about where their church was, their Sunday services, their Sunday school, the Sunday evening services, Wednesday night Bible study, and all kinds of other announcements. But that didn't happen when Dr. King came on to speak. Instead, there was this female radio voice. It was a distinct, nice voice of her own. And she would come on and she'd tell you something about the sermon or the speech, give you some context, maybe what the occasion was and maybe where it was given. And it might be in Birmingham, it might be in Montgomery, it might be in Atlanta, but it might be in New York City, it may be in Chicago, it may be in DC. So I knew this radio preacher, Martin Luther King Jr., was special, but I did not know he was world famous. I did not know he was a civil rights icon. I did not know he was already dead. I did not know he was killed in a place called Memphis, Tennessee, and I did not know why he was in Memphis. Those facts and other details about MLK's life were revealed to me over a period of years. And some of them took a lot of effort on my part because they were not, and in some cases are still not part of the popular narrative that you'll hear when people discuss MLK's life. I want to come back to that point in a minute, but I want you to take a 2-question survey. Kelsey is putting a link to that survey in chat, hopefully. So when she puts that link in, if you would go respond to the 2 questions as quickly as you can. I've watched my girls learn about historic figures over the years. They're 9 years old now, and they read biographies of Rosa Parks, MLK, and so forth. They've been reading those since they were in 1st grade or so. So learning with them, it enlightens me and it reminds me of the bios that I read when I was in 1st grade. So those bios, they tell you when the person was born and they tell you some noteworthy things about the person. But those 1st grade bios, they don't try to cover every detail. They purposely leave out stuff that might be age inappropriate. So as you progress in school and age, biographies get more sophisticated. And they let you in on more painful truths about the challenges people faced as they made effort and sacrifices to push back on society, to make contributions, the contributions that they became celebrated for. So that's how it was with me and MLK. I eventually got to grade school level biographies in 1st grade. And I learned that this radio preacher had actually accomplished some great things in the area of civil rights that helped advance our society. I learned that most of society opposed each of his efforts when he started them. I learned that his house was bombed when his wife and small child were there. I learned that he and his followers were subject to arrest and beatings by police and by mobs, often at the direction or at least with the agreement of elected officials and community leaders. The arc of the biographies leveled off in high school, and they presented MLK as a figure who overcame great challenges even before he gave up his life to help the US society move toward our stated ideas. However, even with those high school biographies, and even now, it's still true that some details about MLK's life get ignored or hidden in plain sight in popular narrative, even when it comes to famous speeches like I Have a Dream, or especially the I Have Been to the Mountaintop speech. I've found that most people do not have a good understanding of why MLK was in Memphis. I can't say exactly when, but at some point I went beyond the high school library and bought a comprehensive biography of MLK myself. I've read several since then, so I can't tell you which biography revealed to me that, towards the end of his life, Dr. King started to speak out against Vietnam and to work more directly and systematically on poverty and the forces that keep people in poverty. And that more of the country turned against him when he started to focus on these issues. In one of those mature biographies, I found out that this radio preacher had accomplished so much and that he was killed in Memphis, and that he had gone to Memphis to support sanitation workers. He was fighting with them for humane employment and fair employment conditions. My guess is I came to understand this fact somewhere between 18 and 25, that he had gone to Memphis because what we still call garbage men at that time had requested his help. This struck me on a personal level because housekeepers and janitors greatly populate my family tree. And I did janitorial work myself during high school and college to earn extra money. So beyond this personal reaction to this revelation that this great man was killed when he went to fight for the rights of people in unheralded jobs, my more mature understanding of Dr. King's life and work made me find a real connection between the idea of civil rights, human rights, and really practical ideas about social justice and how these things permeate in all areas of society, including employment. So I want to share some quotes from the speech that Dr. King gave in support of sanitation workers while he was in Memphis. So 2 workers had been killed by machine malfunction and poor safety conditions in Memphis. So beyond that, in the wages and working conditions, which were very poor, all of this led to a strike. So against the wishes of his closest advisors, Dr. King was making kind of a detour into Memphis for actually a 3rd visit. He had been there before for a speech and had been there for a march that didn't go that well. So he persuaded his advisors that he needed to go back to lead another march for these sanitation workers. So the quotes are revealing, and they speak to employment issues as social justice issues. What might be more revealing is the fact that most people have never seen or heard these quotes. And most people don't think they've ever heard the speech from which I took these quotes. That speaks to a broader point about how the narrative about Dr. King's life obscures certain things. So let me show you the last paragraph of this speech. So the speech I've been referring to is the speech supporting and organizing support for sanitation workers in Memphis, is what most people call the mountaintop speech, or they just say the last speech Dr. King ever gave. I'm certain that I heard parts of this speech from the radio preacher before I was 5. And depending on your age, you like me have probably heard parts of this paragraph at least 100 times. What if every time we heard this speech, it got introduced and played, that we had the context? What if it was called the Memphis Sanitation Workers Speech, or the Fairness in Sanitation Employment Practices Speech? That's probably too much to ask for the speech to have that label. But what if we were conscientious about including the context and the occasion when MLK gave this speech, that it was given in an auditorium full of sanitation workers and people who came to support them? What if we focused on the social and employment justice aspects, that he was there to support people who were doing manual labor? I love that we celebrate Martin Luther King's birthday. I really do. However, I do wish and I do hope that celebrating it will cause us to better understand the things he lived and died for, and that as we move along, that we all become better and work harder for social justice in all contexts, including in employment. Thank you. So Kelsey's gonna tell me if I have time for a question or if there's a question out there.
Seeing no questions at this time.
All right, we were gonna go right to Dr. Mills. We'll have a question session at the end, and I will go check the results of our poll. All right, Dr. Mills.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. King. Let me share my screen with you. So thank you so much, Dr. King, and thank you for organizing this. I think programming like this is just so crucial, and on such an important day, what justice you did to Dr. King's legacy, that's just fantastic, and I appreciate your meaningful work. This is great. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about gender and the work-family interface as social justice issues in employment. And we've seen a lot of this, even if this isn't your research area. You've certainly heard probably more recently in the wake of COVID-19 about gender as a social justice issue in employment than you have in the previous several years, because it really is coming to light more and more. So I want to start off, why isn't this progressing? So I want to start off by showing you a few graphs, and they all say essentially the same thing, and you can find hundreds of others that say essentially the same thing with a quick Google search. But I think they show a very stark reality of the US in terms of work-family leave and where we're currently at when we look at the US in comparison to some other nations in general. Right, so the US, and you may or may not know, ranks last in industrialized nations in terms of government mandated paid leave for new parents. Now, like I said, all the graphs I'm about to show you will say essentially the same thing, but you can see every country here, right? And then the US is well, every country that is in this graph. And then the US is right at the bottom with 0 weeks of paid leave. Now, all of these graphs are talking about parental leave in general, but generally when parental leave is given, sometimes it is just maternity leave, and we'll talk about that as another social justice issue. But all of these are at least paid maternity leave in other countries, and sometimes also paid paternity leave for fathers. Right, so here we see one that actually separates that out a little bit, right? Blue being maternity leave, red being generalized parental leave for either or both parents, regardless of gender. You can see another graphic here, which certainly makes it very stark. Hopefully we can get through this presentation before you all go filing your citizenships for Bulgaria with 56 weeks of paid leave. Now this last graph I find really interesting, because this one actually shows the US with 12 weeks of leave after having a baby. Now, when they're referring to that, they're actually referring to the Family and Medical Leave Act, or FMLA, which we'll talk about briefly momentarily, but that is notoriously unpaid leave. So even in this graph, where they are actually granting the US some weeks, we're still at the bottom. And those weeks, again, are unpaid weeks in comparison to the other countries here that you'll see that are paid weeks, either partially or fully. So again, they're all saying essentially the same thing, which is that the US offers new parents, male or female, 0 weeks as federal policy, 0 weeks of leave after having a baby. Now, in theory, it's easy to think, gosh, that's terrible. But in practice, try to put yourself in that position of having a baby and showing up to work the next day, right? It's untenable, really. And so there are, of course, given how untenable it is, there are, of course, some key US policies that have started to address this. FMLA in 1993 was a key one, and one that if you've heard of one, that's probably the one you've heard of. But again, this is unpaid leave. So it does offer 12 weeks. And it's not just if you have a child, it's also other situations like illness, or of course adopting a child falls into that same bucket, caring for other individuals who might need care. So it does span a wide range of family related needs. But again, it is unpaid leave. And this is certainly where a lot of that social justice component falls in. Now, another key aspect here is that FMLA, although it is federally a federal policy, it does not apply to everybody. So first, you have to hope that that you're employed by a covered employer. So this turns to things like whether it's a public employer, whether it's a private employer. if it's a large enough employer. So if you're working for a small mom and pop shop, you are not going to qualify for FMLA. Again, not even qualifying for unpaid leave. You also, as the employee, have to meet certain requirements. So for example, you have to have been with the organization for 12 months. You have to have worked a certain number of hours for that organization over that time. So of course, from a social justice perspective, one of the things that this does is it means that often the people who need paid leave the most are generally, or are at least often, the ones who also do not have access to paid leave. Now, there are certain other policies that have followed up and have tried to remedy some of the issues with FMLA. The Family Act is still pending in the Senate. It was introduced in 2019. Now that proposes a partially paid leave. Individual states have also tried to rectify this. So there are a number of states now, California, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut. There are approximately 10 now that do mandate it from a state perspective, from a state level, and their federal employees do now qualify also, as of just a few months ago, for a federal paid leave, but there is still no federal policy that grants citizens, employed citizens, paid leave when they have or adopt a child. All right, now the Families First Coronavirus Act, you may have heard of, is a of course, recent policy that has addressed family-related needs from a COVID perspective, because COVID has really shined a very interesting light on a lot of the societally ingrained social justice issues in employment, particularly from a gender perspective, from a socioeconomic perspective, from a racial perspective, and we'll talk about those. So the Families First Coronavirus Act offered partially paid leave to individuals who need to stay home to quarantine, or to care for children who need to quarantine, or whose schools or daycares were closed. So this is a broad overview, of course, but just so you know, there are key US policies dealing with this, but as you saw on the previous slide, they're just scratching the surface. They're not really covering, in particular, the people who tend to need these policies the most. And one of the key issues from a gender perspective here, and I wrote a book about this, or edited a book about this a few years ago, is that massively over the last few decades, gender stereotypical roles are shifting enormously, right? Women are are in the workforce, first of all, more, and they're also in more demanding work roles, right? Men also are seeing increased home expectations and home responsibilities in that domain, whereas they were maybe not 50, 60, 70 years ago. Roles are shifting for both genders, but a lot of policy has not adapted accordingly. The end result, of course, is that work-family conflict is an issue for both genders, and both genders really need policy to recognize that, both at a federal level and also at a company-wide level. And we'll talk later also about the distinction between kind of formal policy, but also kind of just societal and cultural values and how they shape this. The family composite also is shifting, right? You still, of course, have what we would call, what traditionally you would see called the traditional family. But of course, we also have very non-traditional families. We see increased blended families, divorce rates also. We are seeing increase. Same-sex couples are having and adopting children. So the family composite is shifting enormously, but policy is not accounting for this. So we really need a shift in policy. And it's really interesting also to take a step back and see kind of where is the current generation? Where is the generation that is now coming of age? Where's their mindset on this? And a lot of really interesting data has been collected that looks at, for example, the plans of the next generation. And I always think that this is some of the most interesting, because some of this data has seen, current college students, for example, really espousing a lot of very egalitarian values, which is fantastic. But then once you then ask them to report current, kind of look 10 years down the road, 5 years down the road, 15 years down the road, there you see really a vast kind of trajectory turn for, and of course this is the generalization, but broadly the data is showing kind of a vast trajectory turn for men versus women, and even again in college collected data. So people who are actively pursuing education toward a career goal with the plan to be in a career, you are then getting data that's saying women, yes, I'm on this path, but I also assume that one day I will be kind of at home either part-time or full-time out of a career to care for my family, whereas we're not necessarily seeing that in the male data, even when people are espousing egalitarian values. And that also applies, right? That's not just college students, that also applies. We're also seeing similar findings in the adult population data, right? In the kind of working age data group. So couples who, even those who espouse otherwise egalitarian views, we still see women doing more of the household labor, doing more of the childcare hours, doing more of what we would call the mental load in organizing a household. So it is very unbalanced. And as you see, policy has not done a lot to help with that, right? If you have maternity leave, but not paternity leave, it's biased in a number of ways, but it's also kind of reinforcing, pushing more of that workload, the domestic workload, the unpaid workload to women. And so demographics, of course, are also playing a large part here, right? A lot of the, and you can think back to FMLA, for example, where you have many, many requirements, well, several key requirements to even qualifying for unpaid leave, right? And this comes down to, and it relates to things like socioeconomic status of employees, right? The people who are in the low wage jobs for the mom and pop shops are likely the people who cannot afford childcare where they go to work, when they go to work, who need paid leave the most, but cannot access it because they do not qualify and their employer is not obligated to provide it. And that's really where people fall through the cracks when we lack a national level requirement for paid leave. Okay. And then you also see where a lot of the even company level, even privatized company level policies are problematic in terms of, for example, even if a private company decides that we will offer maternity leave, right? Not because we're mandated to, just because we want to and we know the benefits that it provides, both for our employees and also for our organization, right? If you provide maternity leave, right, think about how family structures are changing, right? You could think about if your employee is in a same-sex couple and both of those partners are fathers, they have or adopt children, where does a maternity policy leave them, right? It's kind of useless for them, unfortunately. So really, even when organizations are trying to be good corporate citizens and implement policies like this, it's so critical that they do so with an eye toward really placing it in the context and in a social justice perspective so that everybody who should benefit from it benefits from it, right? Similarly, right, family makeup, right? We hear a lot in the work family realm about, well, what about people who don't have children, right? You want to be able to account for people who have elder care needs, but maybe not child care needs, right? You want to be able to account for, in policymaking, people who have needs beyond one very specific need for one very specific type of employee. Right. Job types are also really relevant here and are a really interesting kind of layer to look at this through. So many STEM jobs or jobs that have very specific or what might be considered dangerous requirements for pregnant women or breastfeeding women are really interesting and a really interesting lens regarding kind of what accommodations are appropriate. So for example, some science-related jobs that require dealing with particular chemicals or jobs that require long-term field work or long-term travel. what we would call gendered jobs, or in particular masculine jobs, also have kind of an interesting lens regarding this, right? It's much harder for a woman to deploy postpartum and still breastfeed her child, right? There's not necessarily an accounting for that. Even, and that's an extreme example, of course, but even within male-dominated organizations, if there's not a culture to support or resources to support kind of family-friendly initiatives, it can really jar a lot of employees, and from a long-term perspective, from an organizational perspective, can lead to those employees falling out of the organization, or what we would call organizational turnover, right? Leaving the company entirely, which of course, again, from an organizational perspective, you're losing talent, right? And oftentimes when talent leaves, talent goes to a competitor. That's what I often tell my students, right? So you really want to avoid that. And there are some, there are policies that you can either implement or just expand from a social justice lens in order to do that and account for more people and do so more fairly. Right. And like I said, we've seen a lot of COVID-19 fallout in terms of a social justice lens with employment too. You may have heard the report, I think last week or the week before, that the numbers came out that in December, the US economy lost 140,000 jobs. And when you broke those out, it ended up that all of those jobs were lost by women. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that men didn't lose their jobs in December. It just means that once you account for the gains and losses, all of those jobs were lost by women. And then once you break it out further, you can actually see that all of those jobs were actually lost by women of color, right? So it's critical to really look at employment trends through a social justice lens. Imagine if you kind of heard the US lost 140,000 jobs in December versus hearing Black and brown women in the US lost 140,000 jobs in December. Those are two really different things. And not peeling back the layers and seeing this for what it is can really lead to or reinforce really poor policy at an organizational level and also on a federal level, and can really blind us to kind of what is actually happening right now, right? We've seen women in general fall out of the workforce in just unprecedented numbers, whereas before the pandemic, they actually were finally getting a kind of a slight gain. We've just seen women take massive steps back in their career. And that's not, I think it's important to realize that that's not a loss that is easily recovered when the pandemic is over, right? These are job progression. These are not just jobs lost, of course, but then you have a gap on your resume. These are years that you would otherwise be paying into Social Security that now you are not. These are not things that are easily recoverable, right? After the pandemic ends, it's just not going to fix itself. So there are very long-term implications here. And we've also seen how gendered and how kind of socially unjust a lot of the structural and societal supports, particularly in the US, are, that we kind of always knew, but COVID really shown a brand new light on a lot of these things. Right, the New York Times put it very well in one of their pieces that said, I have the quote somewhere. It said that women, the US really uses women as this structural kind of societal support as their kind of their fallback plan, whereas other countries have kind of built-in social nets that we don't have. And we've kind of never seen this more in recent history than we are right now with the fallout from coronavirus. So what can companies do? What can organizations do? I mentioned some of the federal policies or lack thereof earlier. And organizations certainly, there are many organizations who are doing great things in terms of trying to equalize, trying to first implement, but then also equalize family-friendly supports for all of their employees, not just a particular subset. And there are some employees who are doing fantastic things and are really thinking outside of the box with that. But also, I always find it important to recognize that it's one thing to have actual policies, right? That's great. it's a necessary first step, but it's not sufficient, right? You also really need to have a supportive culture. If you have policies on the books because you think legally you should, or you think you want to be able to put these out to recruit employees, but you don't support them on a cultural level, eventually, right, that's going to come to light. You also want to avoid a stigma, right, regarding employees. So even you can imagine an organization that has broad parental supports, both maternity leave, for example, and paternity leave. Now, as much as the burden often tends to be on women, some of that is also because eyes are not batted as frequently when a woman says she needs to take maternity leave, as opposed to when a man says he needs to take paternity leave. I was actually, years and years ago, I was in a symposium doing a presentation about, literally about work-family balance as gendered. And one of the presenters could not show up because his wife had just had a baby, and he was not there. And somebody in the audience said, doesn't he have a partner who can take care of that? And it was just so striking. It was so stark because men do get that response more than women do, right? And if we want men to be more involved, we need to give them the supports in order to do so, right? It also shifts more of the domestic labor responsibilities even more to women when we don't give men the workplace or the social support or in order to do so, or we layer a stigma on them, right? If a company is offering a paternal leave or right, a paternity leave, and a man is trying to take it, we need to support them in doing that, right? It's one thing to have it on the books, it's another thing to actually support it and enable it in practice and make employees feel like it is possible for me to take this without any, right, eyebrows raised, without any backlash, just as if a woman were taking it, for example. Right? You also need employees to be aware of the policies. You can bury it in an employee handbook somewhere and never raise it again. And somebody might be missing out on policies that they may very well qualify for, but because it's not part of the informal culture of your organization, or you don't have supervisors or mid-level managers who are really supportive of enabling employees in this way, right? You could end up with employees just not using those policies. You want people to know that they are there. Okay. And of course, related to, I see some things in the chat, maybe I'm running over time. But kind of this last bit just kind of circles back to a lot of what we were talking about previously, which is just in having these policies, but also extending them to reach critical masses of employees who otherwise do not qualify for FMLA, for other supports out there, right? Not just women, but also men, a variety, right? That we're covering all individuals, we're covering a variety of familial statuses, different types of jobs, which of course are differentially held by right, minorities and women, that we really are covering broadened populations here. I see the chat flashing, so I'm gonna hand it off, but I don't know if we have time for questions or not. I'll let Kelsey or Zach tell us that. But that's kind of what I have for you. Thank you. Let me stop sharing.
Thank you. We have some questions and comments. I'm not sure if any of them are directly at you. So let's go ahead and let Sam speak, and then we'll come back and talk about some of the general comments.
It is an honor and a pleasure to be with you all today. You can hear my accent. I'm from a little country in West Africa called Ghana. I knew of Dr. King, Martin Luther King, before coming here, but not as much as I've learned whilst I've been in the US, and I've been in the US since '89. It's remarkable that he was calling for justice of various dimensions. And I am only going to speak to one small slice of it, economic justice. But economic justice, where it pertains to taxation in the system, because economic issues are also quite wide-ranging. My title focuses on Alabama, but before that, I would like to show you a picture of the nation. In the US, we like to say that we have a progressive income tax system, and that's true to some extent, because So that's a picture of average state and local taxes, tax rates in the US. Effectively, what you see there is that for most states, in fact, this is average for the US as a whole, the lowest income people pay more in taxes, in state and local taxes, than the very rich. The gap is about 4% from 11.4 to 7.4 for the top 1%. 45 states have actually very regressive state and local tax systems. And most people don't know that. But that's what we have. The authority on taxation in the US is the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. And they can demonstrate for us that no two state tax systems are the same. Because of that, you would find there is very little into the taxation systems in this country. Bottom line, most of our state and local taxes are regressive. Even the federal income tax that we think is progressive is really not effectively progressive. Some billionaires can say they pay more, they pay less in taxes than their secretaries do in terms of percentages. Because they have ways of deducting that is permitted in the system, deductions that they can take that the rest of us cannot. And that's important to know. So this is a picture of the general taxation, state and local, what we call SALTs, local taxes. But the next slide, please, James.
Yes.
The type of tax matters. And the three biggest taxes we have in this country are income, property, and sales taxes. On paper, national, at the federal level, income taxes are progressive on paper. Effectively, they are not so much. But property taxes and sales taxes are quite regressive across the board, except for the few states that I mentioned and DC, who have somewhat progressive state and local tax systems. And that's the picture for the US as a whole. So keep that in mind. And then I'm going to switch next slide to Alabama. And I'll speak Alabama in the context of growing Alabama's economy. Okay, what we have in Alabama is a very unbalanced system. Our public sector is not optimal with respect to what our private sector is. And because the economy is a system of interacting parts, whenever one is suboptimal, the other is either sub or supra-optimal, which means we are not doing the very best we can. I would suggest that we need a goal of making things better for everybody along the lines of addressing Dr. King's injustices. And income is a good measure so that if we look at income relative to the national average, we will know whether we are progressing or not. Clearly, education is key. You can't do anything without any development without education. We need education to have a good workforce. We need education to improve our culture, our health systems, our infrastructure, etc. So education is key. Education, because of that, is a public good, which means even when private schools are providing it, the benefits are shared so broadly that we all have to chip in. And that's why it's most efficient for us to deal with it from the public aspect. Healthcare is important. But what you notice is in this country, we play with healthcare in a very non-public manner. Most of the world recognizes that healthcare is a public good as well. In Alabama, we can do a lot by expanding Medicaid anyway. That's a topic for another day. We do have a prison problem we have to address, and we know that we need more revenue, and we have to reform both our tax structure and our budgeting. There have been studies and commissions and task forces that have been set up over the years, and they all come to the same conclusion, which is that last bullet, that our tax system is terrible because it raises inadequate revenue. It is regressive, meaning the poor pay more, and it is inefficient in both collection and use. So we can improve it. And next slide. And that's where I am tackling this issue now. This is the Alabama version of what you saw for the nation as a whole. The nation had an average of 11.4% for the lowest quintile and 7.4% for the top 1%, which is a difference of roughly 4%. In Alabama, our difference is 4.9%. That's huge. So our system is even way more regressive. And one of the reasons for that is because we permit a federal income tax deduction. Now, because we do that, the effective tax rate, income tax rate for the rich in Alabama is way lower than the roughly 5% flat tax rate we have. We actually have a slightly progressive system, but it tops out at about 6,000, and so it doesn't have much of an effect. So in Alabama, you can see how regressive our system is. And next slide, James. And it's regressive across all three major components. First, you can see it is very regressive on sales and excise taxes. By our state constitution, the only way communities and counties can raise funds is through the sales tax. For everything else, we've got to go to Montgomery to go get permission. Property taxes in Alabama are quite flat, but still regressive. We don't have a design to make sure that higher income, higher value property pays more, even though it sucks sometimes more out of the system. And our income taxes look as though they are somewhat progressive, but they're really not. The calculation you see there for that line does not include the federal income tax deduction. Now, if you think about it, the top federal income tax rate is 37% now. So the very rich will be able to drop that percentage by another 37% to get to effective rates. Clearly, we have something in Alabama that we know, we have studied for several years, and we know can be improved. So what should we do then? Next slide. I would suggest we have to acknowledge the scale of the problem. And we have a roughly 220 billion GDP economy. So I'm suggesting tackling it from about a 1% of GDP level and move it forward. There's so many uncertainties in the system, and the system is so dynamic that typically you can't just make a calculation and then jump on it. You basically are directing, or steering a ship, so you have to go slowly. But you go with 1%, see what the effect is, then you take the next step. And the 1%, I am suggesting we can do away with the federal income tax deduction. It'll give us about 800 million roughly. Here in Alabama, we apply our sales tax even to groceries. And we know that's, that's something that the poor will have more, that will have more of an effect or adverse effect on the poor and low income folks than the rich. There's only so much food one can eat. But if we can lower the sales tax rate, broaden the base, we typically apply it only to goods, mainly to goods, but let it apply to services as well that sometimes our higher income folks pay for, you can actually raise another $500 million there. We have the lowest property tax, state property tax rate in the country. And even if we raise it from 6.5 mils to 13 mils, it will still be the lowest, but it gives us another 420 million. We addressed through a law a year and a half ago, 2 years ago almost, the Rebuild Alabama Act, where we raised gas taxes, but it's still suboptimal. So we need to raise it, either using road use fees or the gas tax as we know it for another 340 million. And that gives us the 2 billion. On the budget side, because our funds fall in different distributions, sometimes the general fund suffers whilst the education trust fund is flush, or vice versa. Most of the growth is on the educational trust fund side anyways. So that last bullet is just a suggestion from me about the budget side for budget reconciliation and also for providing economic development incentives. We do that quite well, but we do not raise revenues for incentives, and that has an adverse effect on folks as well. Next slide. So the question would be, if we take 2 billion out of consumption and move it into providing for public services, what's the effect? And the effect is clear in this table that you see here. Yes, the first column will tell you when we take it out of consumption, this is the effect is in red. But when we apply it to the public spending that we need to do, is the next column, and the net effect is in the black. So we actually gain. And this is because we are suboptimal currently. Now, everything you've seen to this point, when I showed you those 2 slides on the tax distribution, how it affects people by income, guess who makes less in this state or this country? People of color, women. Yeah. So there is a clear injustice that we need to address. And this small suggestion here would help us some. The quote you see from MLK in there is one that I think most people, is one of the few sermons that he gave that I read in its entirety. And I think that line that is often quoted is not quoted very well because people don't put the ellipses that I have there in the beginning. You need the context to fully understand what Dr. King meant by, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. He's acknowledging the vicissitudes of development. Sometimes it's a 2 steps forward, 1 step back dance. Sometimes it's 3 and 5, but he's saying clearly that we will get there, okay? We will get there. It doesn't mean we sit back and relax, however. And that's what the next quote that I have from A.S. Bayat says. It says, basically, we come in, we contribute our piece. We may not even see and reap the benefit of what we do, but humanity will. And that's an encouragement for all of us to do our part. The justice, economic justice that took Dr. King to Memphis, I have only touched on a small part of it. But I want to encourage all of us that we can do something to contribute to the solution. With that, I'll thank you. again and open it up for questions, comments, suggestions for any of us on the panel, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. I think Kelsey has a question that came in for you.
Yes. So Dr. Addy, there was a question on how the effective tax rate is calculated.
So the effective tax rate is calculated based on what the marginal is that you know that you pay or through the graduated system, less all the deductions that are permitted in the system. Now, and that's a very good question because the deductions are not the same for everyone. And in fact, most low income to middle income people don't even have enough of an income, or they don't have enough deductions for it to be meaningful when they apply it. But the effective tax rate is the actual tax rate paid relative to the income. You will find very few rich people actually pay that 37% federal income tax rate because of all the loopholes in the system and how they can game the system. Now, so far, I've only talked about income. Dr. Mills referred somewhat to wealth as well, and that's an important thing to note. So when it gets to the wealth side, you can actually design sometimes property tax systems that makes things fair. Also, you can make sure that inheritances, or what is improperly called the death tax, can be designed fairly. What people don't realize is when wealth is built and it accumulates, most of the time the accumulation does not experience any taxation at all. So if it is passed on without addressing that, it means you just perpetuating the system and making the rich richer forever. And that's something which is not fair, because actually wealth accumulation also uses public goods and public services. And that's what we use taxes for. So in essence, we need to make sure that both income and wealth are treated fairly in the system.
So I'm going to share the results from the poll and address one of the questions, and then we'll let Kelsey share some of the other comments with us. So those are the results from the poll that 52% of the respondents previously knew why MLK was in Memphis, which this is an educated group that's higher, I think, than the general population, but still it's 52%. And 22% of our respondents thought they had heard the sanitation support speech, which in fact is a mountaintop speech, which I suspect probably 100% of us have heard at least part of the mountaintop speech. We just did not know, as I did not know for many years, that the mountaintop speech was actually given in support of sanitation workers, and the audience was mostly sanitation workers and those who came to support them in their quest for safe and fair employment. So we had a question from one of my great EMBA students, Valencia, who asked a question about more systemic issues, how they play into employment and low wage issues, and therefore how they play into social justice, which is a good question because we can look at issues that look like they have no social justice impact. So we talked about the impact of low wage, of taxes on low wage individuals. And we talked about low wage individuals may be less able to use things like work-family leave policies. But the overall question is, who are the low wage workers and why are they low wage? Which, to Valencia's point, that speaks to a social justice issue in itself. So in that sense, anything that we talk about in terms of low wage or genderized jobs can be a social issue because they may be such because of larger social issues like wealth gap and gender norms in society. So that's a good point that many of the things we don't think about in terms of employment may go to a social justice issue because the place in society people might be employed might stem from a social justice issue. I don't know if the rest of the panel would have anything to add on that.
Yeah, I saw that question. I thought that was a fantastic question. I saw the first part of it said, is this a social justice? Absolutely. And I think Dr. King already spoke to this. Absolutely, this is a social justice issue. And I would say not only is this just a social justice issue, this is the root of a lot of other social justice issues, right? This is like, once you peel back those layers, this isn't just like putting a Band-Aid on something. This is really exposing the heart of kind of how did we get here, right? And why is this continue to propagate itself? And so I think, and then the second half of the question, if I saw it, I think it was piecemealed, if I saw it correctly, was like, how do we deal with this? And unfortunately, I don't know that there's one easy answer because it is so deeply rooted. I think that, and this is just my perspective, and Dr. Addy might have something different. I think it would require radical change because it is such a radical, ingrained problem. I think you have to look toward things like, I mean, you could certainly basic things like expanding paid leave to low wage jobs, right? That would be a bare minimum. It would be my understanding, it would be a bare minimum, but also things like making higher education more accessible, right? Not just financially, but also just logistically, right? Can somebody access an institution of higher education? Can they actually get to it? Right? Can they pay for it? Of course. It's something like universal basic income has been long touted as something that's far too radical for the US, but I think we have seen recently how it can start to create some structural change for these deeply ingrained issues. So that would kind of be my broad perspective, is that it's a deeply rooted issue, and we can scratch the surface of it as long as we want to. And I think that so far that tends to be what policy has done. But I think in order to really get at the heart of it, you do need radical change because it's a deeply rooted problem.
Yes, I agree. It's an excellent question. From my perspective, however, and I started off my career as an engineer, came into economics later. Everything, I'm going to say it, everything is a social justice issue because the system is interrelated. So you can't dodge one and say, oh, we're going to deal with this in this slice. No, it's a system. And that's the basic definition of it. Whether you call it a cultural system, economic system, whatever adjective you put to it, it's a system. So anything in one element of the system affects everything else. Dr. Mills identified a couple of policy issues, but I would try to answer it in a more pastorally, since we're talking about the Reverend Doctor. And the answer is simple. It's really one word. It will shake our culture. It will shake our businesses. It will shake a lot of things. But it's simply what Dr. King would preach: love. It's as simple as that. The math is very clear. If you want to do what's best for yourself, you do it by doing what's best for your neighbor. So I use an example and say, if your neighbor comes to ask you for sugar and eggs or something to go bake a cake, and you say, oh no, I don't have it. Let's say you lie, maybe, you don't want to give it to your neighbor, and your neighbor breaks in and gets the sugar and the eggs, okay? You call the cops come in, catch your neighbor. Guess what? By the end of it, you've wasted resources that you could easily have given the cake and sugar, and maybe the neighbor would have even shared the cake with you. But eventually, when the cops come in and all, guess who pays for your neighbor being in prison? It's not your neighbor, it's you. Okay, so if you really love yourself, you will do what's best for your neighbor. It's as simple as that. So everything is interrelated, and in the pastorally perspective, I would say love is the only answer, borrowing from the song.
Yeah, and that I think that does cover it. I tend to think about it. I say it like this, and I depending on the audience, I'll shift from the pastorally to the HR. But it's actually the same point: is that God gives us all we need on this earth, but it comes in these small packages called people. and to the degree we develop people, we get all the things that we need. So to the degree we develop the people around us, we're better off as a society. So from an HR standpoint, it's the idea that each individual, each group, each organization, and each society is better if each individual reaches their full potential. If each person reaches their best self, then we're all better off. But that means that we all should be invested in that process. You know, it goes back to, you can think about it as a love issue, but it goes back to even as a self-interest issue. If you develop the people around you, you end up better off, which is what Dr. Addy said, just from a different perspective. So it is a holistic kind of question. And I start with educational access. You can start in a lot of places, but you start talking about how people are employed and what level they're employed. I tend to start at an educational aspect, but that's circular because the education people obtain is related to the education their parents obtained, which is related to the employment their parents and grandparents had. So it is all interconnected. Kelsey, where do we want to go from here?
Okay, so the next question I think was directed more to Dr. Mills, but all three of you can chime in. With the transition to remote work because of COVID-19, what are the implications for family leave benefits?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? Because I think effectively it blurs the line, right? It makes it very easy for an organization who is not mandated to provide these benefits to say, it doesn't change your locale. Nobody's telling you to come into the office. You can still do this work from home, right? It makes it, and they probably use nicer words than that, but the effect is it makes it very easy it makes it easier to say no to that request, right? It makes it easier to shift it to things like, feel free to do your work whenever you want, but the expectation then is that you're still getting zero leave, right? So I think that it is, dangerous is a harsh word, but I think that it's dangerous in terms of granting people leave where kind of who might be on that fine line, whereas otherwise that organization or person might get leave, but now they're working from home. And so now it makes it easier to deny it. So I do think that organizations need to be very cognizant of that and need to try to kind of almost take that out of the equation. Cognitively, that's very hard, of course, but understand that it's not just about, are you in this locale, that it's about other reasons why people might need the leave besides just being physically away from their home during the day.
Great.
So
our next,
add one point, though, one of the things Dr. Mills pointed to is the long-term effects of some of these decisions we make. And so, you know, we usually only contemplate the short-term costs of benefits and forget the long-term dynamics of the actions. I think what she mentioned was that even before COVID, we had a big issue in this country, okay, with respect to family leave and all that. So we already had lots of things to do or work to do prior to COVID. And COVID helped really reveal the inequalities in the system across several different dimensions, type of jobs, you know, benefits at jobs, part-time, full-time, you know, gender issues and things like that.
Dr. King, would you like to add to that?
No, those two
Okay.
covered it. I wouldn't try to add anything.
Okay. So we had another question from Linda Parsons about mentoring and informal mentoring relationships typically being homogeneous or at least sharing the same common traits with senior employees. How do you all think that formalized mentoring could help? Do you think that it would create or diminish the social justice issue that you get from sharing common traits within informal mentoring?
I'll jump in there. I mean, I think formal mentoring definitely helps address the problem, but you know, in the theme of what we said before, preferably we'd have broader informal mentoring. So if we buy into this idea that the development of each individual to their greatest potential is to everybody's benefit, then we would cut down on homogeneous kind of mentoring, that people would reach across lines and mentor people across demographic lines. So I think that ultimately that's the best kind of response. But I think organizations can take the initiative and structurally include formalized mentoring programs that break down these lines from a structural standpoint. I think it does. I think it does help, because I think Linda's right that those relationships, because the top of the organization tends to be homogeneous, and you start getting mentoring that reaches out to people within groups that perpetuate something. So that's clearly a social justice issue, and informal mentoring is a way to deal with that. But individuals of good spirit can informally start to address those kinds of things, because not all of those are not malicious kinds of relationships. Those are just, this person's like me, I happen to know him, and I happen to hang out in the same kinds of places, so I end up mentoring them. So those folks who are conscious of these issues and want to be a positive force can just push themselves a little bit to go beyond what they would normally do in the informal mentoring relationships. But clearly organizations can do something in terms of formal mentoring relationships.
Yeah, I think mentoring is a tough one, because I think absolutely you want those formal mentoring relationships, and you want to be able to pair up particularly women and minorities and people in other marginalized groups with people who have been very successful and can give them good advice, regardless of what that person's demographics look like. But I think people will naturally gravitate also to informal, as Dr. King said, informal friendships, which turn into informal mentoring relationships. And I think that's where we need to be very careful, because people do access a lot of resources from those informal networks that people who are left out of those networks do not get access to, right? Sometimes it's information, sometimes it's opportunities. And so I think we have to be very careful with being aware of that, I guess I say, because you can't rein it in. It's very hard to rein in somebody's informal friendship / networking or mentorship relationships. But I do think it's critical to be aware of the additional information and opportunities that are provided in those more heterogeneous relationships that just tend to evolve. And I think the other side of it is, and this is one we continually struggle with, right, is even if you try to pair up people with people who are demographically similar to them, particularly when we're talking about women, minorities, marginalized groups, oftentimes, even though the intent is very good, the end result can sometimes be overburdening those people who are in those groups who are already fighting a little of an uphill battle. To some extent, overburdening them with, okay, you're the only woman, right? You mentor all of the other women who come in. I think that this is a very fine line that organizations really do need to be cognizant of.
One additional point is that the demographics of the country is changing regardless of what we decide to do. So whether we do it voluntarily or not, some of these relationships we will have. And it's better for us to take initiative to do, to follow it rather than wait for the inevitable anyways.
Great. So we have another question, and it was posed as, how can social justice issues surrounding disabled individuals be addressed in the workplace?
So if I may take that one early, we do a lot of the research for workforce development in the state, one of our centers in Culverhouse. And it's one of the things that bug me the most, that the cultural perspective on disability is wrong. Instead of looking to see what is best, what somebody is best suited for, we look from the outside and say this person, we first call them disabled, which I think is a wrong term anyways. But by so doing, you already have reduced the potential of that person to contribute to the system. I think what we should do is change our perspectives to say, here is a contributor. How best can this person contribute? And how can we facilitate that contribution? And once you look at it from that perspective of trying to optimize things for the system, all of a sudden you start seeing the resources that are available. Dr. King, not the Reverend, but our colleague here, said something earlier, and I hope it didn't slip by any of you. Basically, I'm paraphrasing, but he's saying we have the resources to create a little heaven on this earth if we wanted to. Okay, we have the resources. It's how we apply these resources that matter. I think at least cursorily, you can say, hey, disabled people can do these types of jobs, rather than say, because they are disabled, they can't do some other types of jobs. You have to look for the potential and their contribution, and that's key.
And both on the individual and the systemic level. So individually, we have to think about, again, helping people reach their best selves, their top potential. And that applies to everybody. And as Dr. Addy was saying, if you start with that in mind, instead of starting with the limitations in mind, you're ahead of the game. But then from a governmental standpoint, that mindset needs to be built in, that helping people reach their best potential, their best selves is in the public policy. It should be part of public policy because it is for the public good to do that. So I mean, I think that mindset that how do we maximize everybody's potential as opposed to what they can or can't do is helpful on the individual, personal basis, but it's also something we should work harder to build into to public policy.
Dr. Addy, you posed a question to some of the panelists about President-elect Biden's proposal to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Is that something that you may want the audience to maybe just provide some comments on their thoughts about that, if they're aware of the news, or something that you want the panelists to address?
Well, thanks. The minimum wage issue, even $15 an hour, is a shame, given where we were at 32 years ago. So if you really wanted to address that, I think we have to be talking about $18 to $21 an hour. And it's not that this country can't afford it, we can. We have the resources to do it. But that's a topic for another day, because I'll have to go into a whole new set of data and stuff like that. But what I want folks to think of is, and typically what I do in my research is we look at the system as a whole. So when we say, minimum wage, we are not just looking at only the minimum wage and those it applies to. You have to ask the question, okay, if these people now can make the minimum wage, and maybe it's a livable wage, what are the effects on the rest of us? And all of a sudden the benefits start, coming across. You'll find that people will not change jobs as often. They might actually look to improve themselves. They don't have the burdens that they currently have, which makes them do maybe multiple jobs with very little benefits. But a minimum wage livable job brings stability, it brings growth. Often, especially, this comes with the gender side. Okay, more women, more Blacks, more Browns get these low incomes or jobs with these low incomes. Can you imagine how much time we will release if we can make life better for those folks? And not just the time, but the potential. All of a sudden, they can afford to actually go to school to improve their skill sets, because now they can live on what they are making, and so their potential becomes glaring. And I know I'm coming from a third world country, so I see the US as a land of milk and honey, but I think for me personally, it makes me see the resources that are available and that are so skewed, because the system over a few decades have shifted resources into ownership, which is not beneficial for the country as a whole. But frankly, if coming back to the minimum wage issue, $15 is the bare minimum they should be talking about. $15 is something that would be appropriate for an Alabama with low wages, not for the country as a whole.
So we have to, I know we only have a couple minutes, but you have to speak to the argument that if we do that, we end up with fewer people employed.
That's been demonstrated in all the research that is wrong. I wouldn't even give it much time. Because again, the early research that looks at that does not look at it from the system-wide perspective. If you only look at it as a slice, then yes, you'll say, oh, some people can't afford to pay medical. That's not true. Because as soon as you raise their income, you've also raised demand in the system. And that means that they can demand more. So all of a sudden, the people who thought they would go out of business can actually have opportunity for higher demand for their services and goods. So again, the system-wide perspective is always important. You have to look at that, and you also have to look at the long term. So time and system is always important. So I will debunk that stuff about minimum wage hurting is been debunked by so much research that it's not even worth paying attention to.
So Kelsey, I saw one question I think may have slipped by about whether hiring, promotion, and discrimination claims are social justice issues. So I think they are, and there's two ways to look at it. That there's the direct issue about discrimination itself, but the real social justice, or I think the most direct social justice piece of that is how we treat those claims. And those claims get, the treatment of those claims get treated differently depending on who's in charge of various civil rights enforcement mechanisms. So whether a claim gets investigated, whether it gets taken seriously, whether it gets prosecuted, that clearly becomes a social justice issue. Whether or not you can have your claim heard and adjudicated is a justice issue in a very real kind of sense, beyond the idea of the discrimination in itself. So yes, those things, the claims and how those claims are treated is a very direct justice issue and a social justice issue.
Dr. Addy, there was one follow-up question to the 15 or the $18 to $21 minimum wage. And that question is, would that be sustainable for small business owners?
So the question is what I call the slice type of question. It did not address what the higher income, the increased demand that's has been made. It's only look at the cost side for the small business owner. Once this person has a higher income, they can afford to pay higher prices. They can afford to pay other services. The business person who is paying the employer is also looking only at their cost, not at their income potential from having higher demand in the system or higher, spending capacity in the system. When you put that other aspect in, the answer is yes. They can. The small business person can afford to pay the person. If the small business, and this is not an insensitivity issue, this is just an objective point. If that small business cannot survive based on a new minimum wage, then I would suggest that that business was already in trouble prior to a higher minimum wage. Because basically saying one small cost is affecting that person, that business.
So for the
it is sustainable in the system-wide sense that small businesses will also adjust because they'll be able to adjust their prices and income. They will also be able to keep their workers longer. They don't have to train them. I mean, the HR specialist is Dr. King. There's a high cost to, change in your workplace like that. And often, sometimes, what we found actually is in some of our research is some businesses are willing to pay more just to avoid their people leaving and they having to retrain and all that and rehire and all that. And actually, some workers would accept a very small increase just so they don't leave, you know, and so you would have these factors that come in that when you consider them in the system, it's worthwhile.
I think you make a good point about those calculations, because you're right. We usually don't think about the fact that if the minimum wage were increased, you'd have more buying power in the market, where
Right.
prices could be higher. If you got a product that people want, then the demand could be higher. And then you've got the transaction cost that you mentioned of employees turning over, going from place to place. So there's a transaction cost, and then there's a learning curve and so forth. So you know, doing that analysis is more complicated than the analysis we usually see. So I think I need to bring us to a close. We're at the end of our time. Let me again thank our panelists, Dr. Addy and Dr. Mills. Thank Zach and Kelsey for helping us out, and really appreciate the folks who tuned in today, and those who gave us some questions and some suggestions that we should further discuss. Hopefully we will have some more events of this type. Until then, everyone take good care.